having execution is essential. All right, just some definitions, because you have to understand at what level you're operating. Grand strategy, think of Lincoln and saving the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it, okay? That was his grand strategy. That was his fundamental goal. A strategy was General Scott's what they called the Anaconda Plan, where they would strangle the Confederacy by a blockade. Grand strategy. Strategy. Campaigns in the West. Union forces working against Confederate forces on operations. Fort Donelson, particular battle. Tactics, how you would attack. Okay, different degrees. You need to understand where you are in order to right-size your work you're doing. So when you think of strategy, operational objectives, tactical objectives, strategy versus execution, great difference in the amount of detail you need, and where you are, you have to understand that first, okay? In business, the challenge about defining your objective is you never start. You never start with a blank sheet of paper if you're in a corporation. They already have a strategy. So in effect, what you're trying to do is change how you're doing business while you're doing business. But as General von Moltke puts it, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. So things change. Or as I would put it, no business plan survives first contact with the customer. Okay, different types of planning. Issue or event, usually focused either by time or event. Product strategies, single products versus business strategies, which are multiple products. Competitor assessment, new business development. These are the areas in which you will apply your trade, but they're different. I'm not going to give you the toolbox for these. That's not my job today. But in general, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to get to some level of intel based upon data and analysis. And the biggest challenge that you face is getting from a fire hose down to a teacup, because there's so much data for you today. And figuring out what part of that fire hose goes into the teacup. And all too often, you get the wrong stuff in the teacup. Then once you get that intel and analysis, you're supposed to be creative. And we'll talk about the creative part of this in a minute, but you want to develop insight as to what's going on. This is hard. I love this. There's a great quote from Mark Twain. You want to give me a 2-hour presentation, I'm ready today. If it's a 5-minute speech, it's going to take 2 weeks. Getting that all down, analyzing it down to its essence, getting to the essence, getting it to one page, that's a challenge. And then finally, that insight allows you to then develop strategy. This is a real-life business set of strategy outcome or performance outputs. This was from a McKinsey article. An actual company planned. Those were their strategies, and that's what they actually did, okay? Suggests that this isn't easy. Okay, what kind of intel do you need? 3 types of intel, I would argue. When we talk about competitive intel, we're really talking about stakeholders, not just competitors. We're talking about customers, distributors, whomever is in your value chain. That's what happens at a very tactical level. Market intel is what goes on in the industry. So think transport sector. Competitive intel would be what's happening with Ford. Market intel is what's going on with vehicle electrification. That's impacting the industry. Strategic intel is the larger business environment, demographics, urbanization. Who's going to buy electric vehicles? Where is the infrastructure for them? Okay, those sorts of questions. Timing, different levels of timing. Intel types, you'll be getting into human, SIGINT, all of these. We're not going to talk about legal constraints. The point is, when I started out, you basically had to get on your horse and go out and gather human. And it was a real pain in the ass. Now you're drowning inhuman. You're drowning in SIG. You've got more OSINT than you know what to do with. Okay, Intel. Does anybody recognize that painting? It's from the diorama at Gettysburg. Famous painting, circular painting of the Battle of Gettysburg. Third day, the height of the battle, Pickett's charge. They're coming up here. This is the high water mark of the Confederacy. Okay, well, let's talk about Lewis Armistead, Confederate general leading part of Pickett's charge. There he is on his horse. I'll make him a little bit bigger so you can see him. Very famous painting. Everybody who goes to Gettysburg goes, oh, there he is. Well, unfortunately, Lewis Armistead at that point was not on a horse. He was actually walking. Okay. On the other side of the field, Winfield Scott Hancock. There he is. There's his horse. There you see him. Okay. They were bosom friends before the war, both Union officers. In fact, Armistead had left his Bible with Longstreet to give to Hancock's wife, should he die in the battle. I mean, this is poignant shit, okay? At this point in the battle, though, at the moment Armistead is shot, he's not on his horse. He's already been shot in his back at the medical tent. Very dramatic picture. It just happens to be wrong. So when you are getting into the intel collection, understand the difference between primary and secondary intel. Understand the difference between data, analysis, and opinion. All right, let's talk inside the gate first, competitive intelligence. Understand that what you're doing isn't really any different than what lawyers and media do. They're looking at who, what, where, when, how, why. First, know yourself, okay? If you're in a business or any kind of entity, think about your own group. How many of you consider yourselves millennials? Anybody? Well, you're not. You're Gen Zers. So I don't know what Harold Cray Cray means, but I guess Gen Zs talk different than boomers. The point being that every generation has certain attributes. Millennials are different than Gen Z or different than boomers in certain attributes. Understand that. Decision making. Does your organization have dictatorial decision making or paralysis through analysis? Culture. Click. I wish I could click on it. I can't click on it. I can't do it. Can I click? Is there?
There should be.
Online?
Yes.
Oh.
Try it.
Love it. This is your strategy. That's culture. And that's no joke. I'm going to roar through this. This is cultural arrogance at its height. That is a VHS cassette player. Okay, I don't know if any of you remember seeing one of those. When it first started out, when we first got those, you had the small Renaflex places, and then everyone else came along. But Blockbuster, boy, they took over. And that's where you went to get your VHS tapes or your beta tapes if you were stupid about that beta. And then Netflix came along. And Netflix went to Blockbuster and said, why don't you buy us? Blockbuster said, are you all right, friggin' buy? Well, of course, you know, there's no Blockbuster left. And you know what Netflix looks like now. I used to work for GE Appliances. Boy, the arrogance there. GE sold it off to the Chinese. And this was just last week. GE froze the pensions of retirees. Talk about arrogance. And the point being, when you're successful, it's the hardest time to change. It is the hardest time to change. Know your customer. When I first got to Lubrizol, I was told the story about when a chronometer maker came in, watch maker came in, and said, I need some very, very special lubricant for watches. And Lubrizol, specialty additive company, spent time in treasure and tested, come up with a very specialized chemical for this watchmaker. Called watchmaker back in. And we've spent millions of dollars, we've done all of these hours of testing, and we now have for you, here is the chemistry you need. That's great, thank you. Okay, great. Take out the order book, how much you want? About 6 ounces. You have to understand what your customer wants. When I worked for Electrolux, they had a wood cabinet company. And we were doing an analysis as to whether or not to invest more money in the cabinet company, and we did an examination of all the competitors, but there was something wrong with it, and I called in a friend of mine from ADL, and let's take a look at this again. And what we discovered is we missed Bubba. Bubba works out of his pickup truck, and he's the local guy on HGTV that makes all the cabinets, okay? Now, Bubba doesn't know what the hell an ROI is. And he doesn't really care. All he wants is enough cash to buy another box of screws and a 6-pack of beer and go on to the next project. If you have a ROI of 14% as your rate that you've got to hit, you cannot compete against Bubba. And so maybe Electrolux sold the wood cabinetry business. So what are you selling? Well, where are you on the Slywatsky value curve, okay? Are you in a high revenue, unique product, or are you selling a commodity? What's your cycle time? Are you selling toilet paper, or are you selling refrigerators? How quickly does that product turn over? Where are you? Is your geography global? And is your focus global? Or are you specialized? This was a bottle that was a short run of 3 dozen, 4 dozen that my son brewed for his brother's wedding. Can't get more customized than that. Give you an example, AB Electrolux. It's an eye chart, but that's all over their locations. Global corporation, and we'd have meetings, and the CEO, Leif Johansson, would say, our global language is bad English. Because we got Swedes and Germans and Japanese and Italians, so we all try and speak English. But whenever a serious issue came up, the Swedes in the world, okay, they'd immediately drop into Swedish, okay? And you didn't know a damn thing as to what was going on with your company. When is your focus? Well, again, that durability, do you know how quickly you're going down that value curve? Cautionary tale. I don't know if anybody of you ever saw this movie, 1998. This was You've Got Mail when it was still back when the telephone thing, you had to dial it in anyway before you know. Okay. Tom Hanks, Meg Ryan, she's got the small little bookstore. He's got the big bookstore that runs her out. But they meet each other online and live happily ever after. That is until Amazon comes along and blows him up. Okay. Cycle time acceleration. How quickly does that curve accelerate? Heard of Michael Porter's 5 forces? You will at some point. Michael Porter's 5 forces. Nobody talks about the fact that Michael Porter's consulting group went bankrupt. Why does this guy, who writes all this stuff, well, basically he was arguing for a sustainable competitive advantage. There is no such thing as a sustainable competitive advantage. When corporate archaeology. This is a LiDAR showing the jungle and Inca villages and temples that have been discovered using LiDAR. It's really cool. The example for me is trying to do the undercover on your business or government. Any entity you go into, think of that culture came from someplace. There is an archaeological dig in any entity you go into. Think of 2 paychecks. When I first entered Lubrizol, I got 2 paychecks, one every 2 weeks and one every quarter. Why? Why am I getting a paycheck every quarter? Because during the Second World War, it was a way of getting around wage and price controls to give benefit or bonuses to the employees. And in 2000, they were still issuing 2 paychecks. What was really interesting is that most of the spouses of Lubrizol employees were unaware of the second paycheck, but that's another story. So how are you making money? Is it evolutionary change? Is it revolutionary change? This is an example of the impact of revolutionary change. You go back to 1995, virtually all washing machines were top loaders. And then through DOE rulemaking, we drove to front loaders, which you can find now, loaders and Home Depot. And you can see how quickly the penetration came of front loaders. And then finally, the philosophical why. I would suggest you look up Simon Sinek. If you get the slides, you click on it, it'll take you to a video. Understand why you're doing what you're doing. If only reason for what you're doing is to make money, that's a sucky reason. Okay, now let's look outside the gate. Competitive, market, strategic intel, what do businesses look at today? Well, they're looking all at competitive. They do some market, but they do precious little strategic. It's all about the next 2 years. Maybe they pay some lip service 5 years out, but nobody's looking at long term. When you do those competitive assessments, those pestle forces get changed by that business environment. Cautionary tale. Lubrizol made a product, diesel water fuel emulsion. Why would I make a diesel water fuel emulsion? Because it reduced the emissions. It worked very well in that old bus, and it blew out the pumps on newer engines. Because we didn't see the change in the technology, we didn't bother to look at the future. So when you think about value chains, how do I allocate money? How many pennies for every dollar the customer pays do I get in the value chain? Understand that the value chain looks one way today with strengths and weaknesses for you and your competitors. But the question is, what's it going to look like tomorrow? That's the challenge. Today, you know. Tomorrow, that's the challenge. And value chains can be very complicated. Who? Quantitatively, think about head count. Does the competition filled with a lot of old experienced people or young wingnecks? And you can figure that out. You can figure out who they're hiring, okay? Qualitatively, the nature of the leaders. Now, think back to what we were talking about earlier about anthropological stuff, okay? Not only the leader, but that group of 6 to 10 people in his leadership team. What are their personalities? How do they behave? What kind of decisions had they made in the past? Where had they worked? Do they have kids? Where did they go to school? Nobody really spends a lot of time looking at that. Great example from the Civil War. Sherman, on his march to Atlanta, was constantly confronting Joe Johnston. Johnston kept retreating. Jeff Davis replaced him with John Bell Hood because he knew Hood would attack. What made the Civil War interesting is all the generals knew each other if they had gone to West Point. Sherman knew Hood. Sherman knew Hood would attack. He knew his personality, and that's exactly what Hood did. 3 days in a row, leading to 3 Confederate defeats and the loss of Atlanta, because Sherman was prepared for it, because he knew the personality. What are you selling? SKUs, quantitatively, the value proposition and its performance, the change of it over time. understanding that not only for the stakeholder, but for the industry as a whole. Think vehicle electrification, think autonomous vehicles and those impacts. Where are you dealing? Are you decentralized? Where are your markets? Qualitatively, what's the reliability of utilities and transport? Nexus to markets. When are you acting? Again, cycle time, change over time, and here we're talking about competitors. What's their decision-making culture? What's their archaeology? How are they operating? Supply chains, sales, marketing, change over time. I'm hitting this at a very high level, but to understand there is a range of complexity to what you need to do to be accurate and thorough. But most importantly, why? Why? Not just the what of they're doing, why are they doing what they're doing? If you want to understand the North Koreans, you have to understand North Korean history and understand why they are behaving the way they do. And unless you develop that context, the what isn't going to get you much. You have to understand the why. Old adage, 5 whys. It's not just 5 whys, it's constantly asking why. Don't stop asking why. So I'm going to run through some lessons learned. Death by precision, okay? Don't confuse precision and accuracy. Okay? You can be very precise and be inaccurate. I would rather have imprecise accuracy than precise inaccuracy, okay? Look instead for orders of magnitude, patterns, trends over time. I would argue demographics explains 70% of everything and geography explains the rest. Nobody talks about that stuff. Priorities, working on the wrong thing. This is a very famous Drucker quote. Managers do things right, leaders do the right things. Every place I have worked, government and industry, you have so many people doing things right that don't need to be done. Working on the shiny thing because it's new and it's novel and it's cool, but it doesn't really have a whole lot to do with what you're trying to do. Confusing the set with the scene. Great movie, Death Race, 2000. David Carradine. This movie, they had several of these cars that they had all souped up. And because they spent the time and the money on the cars, they spent a lot of money on making these cars look cool, that all they showed in the movie were these damn cars. Because look, we made these great cars. And it was all about the setting. It wasn't about plot, it wasn't about anything else, but look at these cool cars. I'll contrast that with Star Wars. Now you remember Return of the Jedi, they had this enormous set built for very few scenes. And if you listen to, what's his name, I can't think of his name at the moment, the guy that, George Lucas, he was basically saying you don't want to focus on the set, you want to focus on the scene taking place on the set. So priorities, don't get what's right. Death in the weeds. Perspective and context, getting the right perspective. Beginning of the First World War, British soldiers did not have steel helmets, they wore cloth helmets. And they had a high rate of head injuries from aerial bursts over the trenches. Okay. They now issue steel helmets. The number of head injuries increase. British general says we should get rid of the helmets. Does that make sense? What actually was happening is they were ignoring deaths. When you added the helmets, you had more injuries, but you had fewer people getting killed. So the helmets were turning deaths into injuries. But since they didn't look at the deaths, only the injuries, they got the wrong result. Death in the weeds. Recognize that you may be working very hard on something that doesn't count, okay? And you're truly picking fly shit out of the pepper. Let it go. And of course, the ever popular paralysis through analysis. The more data that you have, The more options that you generate, the less your ability to make a decision. Correlations, an interdependence of two or more variable quantities such that change in the value of one is associated with a change in the value and expectations of the other, versus causation, the act of causing, producing an effect. This is a correlation. This is a correlation. And this is a correlation, one of my favorites. Don't confuse the two. Just because two things track doesn't mean that one necessarily causes the other. Understand always the difference between correlation and causation. Okay. Sooner or later, you'll be working on things and it all goes pear-shaped, okay? Now, this is one of the first things I learned in basic training, and you can substitute ma'am for sir as appropriate. But there are basically only 4 answers to any question. Believe me, there are only 4 answers. Yes, sir. No, sir. Sir, I do not understand. And no excuse, sir. I'm not fooling. Nobody gives a damn about an excuse for why you didn't perform. Okay, sooner or later, you're going to get reamed a new word because either your fault or otherwise. And this is going to happen, okay? And the challenge is whether or not you take it personally. Recognize that, again, doing that isn't professional and it won't help you. Shrug it off. Don't own your work, okay? The work isn't you. If somebody criticizes your work, they're not necessary. You've got to maintain that distance or it'll eat you alive. Brandolini's law. The amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than the amount needed to produce it. Well, there is a difference between lying and bullshitting. Lying is you are intentionally saying something false. A bullshitter is simply obfuscating and trying to change the game, okay? As it turns out, Canadians are probably the best bullshitters. Any Canadians? The point is, don't do that. If you got an axe to grind, don't do that. Not in this profession. We've got enough of these people in this profession. Confusing advocacy and analysis. Picking sides. Our system is basically based on Anglo-Saxon history and jurisprudence. Trial by combat, when you think about the scales of justice, there are only 2 scales. We think in terms of binary activity. Us, them, 2 sides. It's sort of hardwired into our culture, Anglo-Saxon culture. Our jurisprudence is not about finding the truth, it's about winning and losing. There's always 2 sides, okay? The point is, if you've watched The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, you realize that many times there are 3 sides, or 4 sides, or 5 sides to an issue. So don't get sucked into advocacy and picking a side. Ignoring what your boss doesn't want to hear. This is right up there with bullshitting, okay? Painting the roses red. I hope you've heard that phrase. That means I already know here's the cross, I'm gonna build a church under it. I already know what the answer is that I want, and I'm only looking for the data that supports it. Okay? Don't do that. We have enough people in this profession that do that. This is the biggest problem with the media at the moment, is they're way too busy advocating and not reporting. Finally, if you've done it right, don't apologize for something you did right.